Welcome, everybody. Another edition of Legend Sports Amplify. We're talking history, baseball history, sports history, and tonight I am really happy to have on author Andrew Maraniss. Welcome aboard, man.
Thank you. I'm excited to speak tonight. Thanks for having me on.
All right, awesome. And you were right off the. You were just at a baseball game. Tell us, yeah, you were just at the Vanderbilt game. So yeah,
Yeah, I live in Nashville, and I took my son today. I took my daughter yesterday, but they're in the NCAA Super Regionals. I got a good sunburn. I don't know if you can tell, but they beat East Carolina
who
both
pitched?
games, so they're headed to Omaha for the College World
Who
Series.
pitched today? It was Kumar Rocker yesterday. I saw it the day before.
Yeah, today was Jack Leiter, who's Al
Oh wow!
Leiter's
What?
son.
Oh my goodness! What a pitching staff! How on earth, right? I mean, those. I mean, they're two guys that could go 1-2 in the draft. Who knows? I mean,
Yeah,
they're
it's
both.
possible. I think they'll both be taking the top five, very likely. So,
I would
it's
think so.
special staff.
So yes, I'm excited. We were talking just a few minutes before we got on here about what I'm trying to do, and I really the books that you've written have really, I mean, fits right in with the stories I'm trying to tell because with the Negro Leagues, um, the context and the backstories are so important, and that's why I think the books that you've written shed some light on some things that I don't think a lot of people have a lot of exposure to, but should.
Right.
Just like many of the authors I've had on, already in the last couple of weeks to months regarding Negro League baseball history, and that's why I'm really excited to talk to you about these books. What I love though, I love origin stories. So tell us a little bit about you and your journey and how you got where you're at and into writing the books that you did. I'm always curious to hear these origin stories from everybody that I talk to.
Yeah, that sounds great. So I was born in Madison, Wisconsin,
Oh well.
and my father and my grandfather are both journalists. We moved to, my grandfather was editor of the Capital Times, which is a newspaper in Madison. My family moved to the East Coast when I was 5 years old. Eventually, my father took a job with the Washington Post and is semi-retired now, but has been there since the mid 70s. So I grew up mostly in DC, reading a really good newspaper, the Washington Post, every day. I was exposed to journalism, at a young age. All my parents' friends seemed to be writers. So that was something that I was accustomed to. We moved to Austin, Texas when I was in high school. And I played baseball at Austin High and was sports editor of the student newspaper there. And one day there was an advertisement poster on the wall of the high school promoting a scholarship to Vanderbilt here in Nashville. And it was for high school sports writers. And it paid full tuition to this good school, So I
Uh-huh.
applied for it and I was lucky enough to win it. And that's how I ended up coming to Nashville to study on a sports writing scholarship. And
Nice.
my sophomore year, there was another kid who had won the scholarship a year ahead of me. His name is Dave Sheinin. He's now a writer for the Washington Post sports department. And he wrote an article about Perry Wallace, who was essentially the Jackie Robinson of the SEC. He was the first black basketball player in the SEC, first black player in any sport to play a full 4 years in the SEC. And I was taking a black history class at that time. And so I asked my professor if I could write a paper about Perry Wallace, I'd never heard of him before, never heard his
Hmm.
story before. And I thought she was going to say no. I thought she would say, we don't write about sports in college. That's not a serious enough subject. But thankfully, she said yes. And so I called Perry, who at that time was a law professor in Baltimore, and wrote a paper about him. And that paper was the most interesting thing that I did in college by far. And so his story always stayed on my mind. And it was 17 years later in 2006, was working at a PR firm here in Nashville and looking to do something creative that was, of my own interest, rather than writing on behalf of clients that I may or may not have really
Hmm.
cared about what their business was. I wanted to do something on my own. And so I went back to this college paper that I had written and I emailed Perry and asked if he remembered me. And he said yes. I don't know if he really did or not. And I didn't have to ask his permission to write a biography of him. Anybody could write about whoever they want to, but I wanted to see if he would cooperate, do interviews, introduce me to people, share pictures and letters and that sort of thing. And he said, go for it. And so that started this process. I had really no idea how long it might take to write a book. It took me 8 years
Oh,
because I was
wow.
doing it, at night and weekends outside a regular job,
Hmm.
and had got married and had two kids in the middle of that 8 years also.
Uh-huh.
So took a while, but working on that book really kind of changed my life in a lot of ways. I rediscovered my love of writing and writing about sports, and seeing that you could tell important stories through sports, that dealt with issues like racism, with an athlete at the center of the story. I adapted that book for middle school students. So there's a young readers edition of it. And, I've written two books since then, published two books since then. I'm in the middle of writing another one right now. And both of them also deal with sports and social issues. My second book, Games of Deception, is about the first U.S. men's Olympic basketball team at the 1936 Olympics
Hmm.
in Nazi Germany. My new book, Singled Out, is about Glen Burke. It's a biography of the first openly gay Major League Baseball player.
Hmm.
And then I'm working on a book now on the first U.S. women's Olympic basketball team, which played in 1976 in Montreal. But it really all goes back to that poster on the wall of my high school, sending me to college, showing me that writing about sports was a worthy thing to do, and meeting Perry Wallace, writing that paper and discovering that you could tell more important issues through an accessible topic such as sports. It's a way to get into these
Hmm.
stories about racism and fascism and homophobia, but in a
Hmm.
non-threatening way with a basketball
Yeah,
player or a
that's a great
baseball
point.
player on the cover.
That's a great point because all of your books touch on some really deep and important topics, um, but yet maybe, like you said, by using the venue of sports, you're able to maybe hopefully get that in front of people who may or may not have picked it up before. Because you got to admit, I mean, I'm a history buff myself, but and I've read my share of books, I can tell you, on World War II and the lead up to World War II. But to mix in a story about the first Olympic basketball team and how that ties into all that is just, I mean, it's just fantastic. It reminded me a lot of um, the story about the Jesse Owens story that
Mm-hmm.
was done similarly. That told that story to through the lens of an athlete, but it was really telling the story about a whole lot of other issues that were going on in the world. So,
Right.
and that's what I think is great about it. I've got your website. I'm going to put it up.
Okay.
And we can talk through some of these other through these as we're going through because I think it's I think it's great. If you just had you want to give the quick 2-minute cliff notes on I don't want you to I don't want to steal your thunder on the books, but
Yeah.
to go through these books and tell people what they're about because these are not just books about sports. These are books about um, like you mentioned, racism, prejudice, fascism, World War II, Olympic history. It goes through a whole series of things. And you know what? You gave me hope because I've been dabbling in writing for a long, long time. And if it took you 8 years and you stuck it out and you did it, yeah, I'm going to
Thanks.
keep on sticking it out myself
Good.
because
Please do.
yeah, because I'll tell you what, it's not easy when you have a day job. I can tell you that.
No.
So I'm gonna put up your website and we'll take a look. We'll start with
Yeah.
the strong inside because I know in reading about it. Let me just find it here. Hold on. Um, it is now required reading for Vanderbilt freshmen.
It was for 2 years in a row, 2016 and in 2017, incoming freshman, which I was really proud about, because this is a book, Strong Inside, there it goes,
Hmm.
um, that talks about racism that occurred on Perry Wallace's campus. It's not just about how difficult it was for him when he traveled to Mississippi or Alabama, or Georgia, Louisiana, but about the loneliness that he felt on his own campus, the ostracism he felt from white students on his own campus.
Hmm.
And so the idea that that university, Vanderbilt, would then require freshmen to read about it before they've even taken a single class at the school, I thought took a strong university to do that. But it was a smart decision on the school's part because it allowed students to look at an issue that took place in the past, but is still relevant today,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of a forum for them to say, okay, let's look and see how Perry was treated. What was, how did students deal with each other back in the 1960s? What can we learn from that? How do we make this school better for everyone today? And so it was really rewarding for me as an alum of the school also, and someone who really cared about Perry Wallace, uh, to see the school embrace it rather than push it away. It would have been easy for them to say, we don't want anything to do with this story. It's not 100% positive, which is what I think a lot of organizations would do.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, that was great. But the story talks about what it was like for Perry growing up in the South in the civil rights era. There were lunch counter sit-ins in Nashville when he was 12 years old, and he witnessed those with his own eyes. He started high school a week after MLK's "I Have a Dream" speech.
Hmm.
He was in high school for the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and so he sort of could sense that things were changing. He told me he felt like opportunities would be coming for his generation that hadn't been there for older generations, and he wanted to be prepared for those opportunities. And so he was a great basketball player. His high school team won 3 straight state championships, but he was also the valedictorian of his class. Perry was a brilliant guy. Ended up becoming a law professor at American University. And so he chose Vanderbilt because of the strong engineering department and the chance to play major college basketball, but really wasn't too excited about what he suspected the environment would be on the road, and how difficult it would be in many cases to be the only Black person in these gymnasiums that he was playing in. He told me that he was concerned he would get shot and killed just for stepping on the basketball court, which sounds extreme, but you think about the fact that leading up to his days at Vandy, major figures with a lot of security around them, like JFK, RFK, MLK, they were shot. Mm-hmm. And so that's on Perry's mind when he steps on the court. And so it took a tremendous courage for him on the court and off the court. And I really, it was a labor of love, those 8 years working on that book. And he was still living when the book came out. And so we would do events together. And that was really rewarding for me to see him sort of receive the respect and the love that he had been due for 40 years. But when he was telling the truth about the racism that he was enduring at the time, people didn't want to hear it. Mm-hmm. And so it took 4 decades for people to finally, white people, to be willing to listen to Perry's story. And so I was glad that he had that opportunity to be listened to and understood.
Amazing. An untold story for 40 years is it's an awful long time to, boy, oh boy. And when I read about it, it just reminded me of when I was going to college at Penn State and the story of, where we are, Penn State, where that comes from.
Right.
And it just reminded me of how, the next generations after that kind of were able to learn from the experiences that were going on. Before we got on here, we were talking about, it was the 45th anniversary. I was running the movie Bingo Long's Traveling All-Stars and Motor Kings. And, 1976, you would never see a movie like that produced today. Or if you did, it would certainly be a little less, it would be done differently, let's just say.
Right.
And that's a tough call, right? Because honestly, that was really the way it was. Just like in the 1940s, it was different. In the 1920s, it was different. No one is saying, I don't think we have to change it all. I think you need to know those perspectives and learn from them and hopefully become better from it, rather than just pretending that they didn't happen, I guess, is my take on it. So, this book, to be the first Black basketball player in the Southeast Conference, I would imagine he had a little bit of adversity going on, I'm sure.
Well, absolutely. Well, I mean, his freshman year, University of Mississippi refused to play against Vanderbilt simply because Black players on the team.
Interesting.
So that he dealt with that. Then the next year, the first time he does play in Oxford, Mississippi, he takes an elbow to the face, intentional, bleeding. Referees don't even call a foul. And I interviewed the student manager who walked Perry across the court to the locker room for the ice bag. He said the crowd stood and cheered the fact that Perry was bleeding. And then poured Cokes on them as they got through the
Uh,
tunnel
uh-huh.
to the locker room.
Mm-hmm.
But then what it was interesting what Perry said about what he told me the most difficult part of that experience for him was not that. It was at halftime, there's a clock in the locker room that lets you know when the second half is about to begin. And when that got down to zero, everybody else on the team ran back on the court and they left Perry on the training table by himself. And after all he'd endured in the first half, nobody stuck around with him to kind of walk back on the court with him, and show the
Mm-hmm.
crowd we've got our teammates back.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a type of
Mm-hmm.
sort of
So
lonely experience this pioneering journey was for Perry.
So that's a an element that I know. We'll talk about some more when we get to singled out. But we I talked to you briefly before we started about this, but the context of all of this, right? So the Negro Leagues, which are near and dear to me, have this perception by many people that they were not of major league caliber, and many of it has to do with stereotypes, misconceptions of it over the years, barnstorming, the clowning, the vaudeville type, that sort of thing. But what people need to understand with Perry Wallace's story and with many stories like that, if you don't have to deal with that sort of um, pressure constantly, day in, day out, every minute of your day, uh, how, how, how can you perform at 100% at peak ability when you are always under these, pressures outside of that? And that's, all respect to these guys who did what they did and persevered. And I think people, that's the one thing I wish people would try to wrap their heads around, is that until you've walked in these guys' shoes, it's really hard to, just put numbers on a piece of paper and say this is the way it was. And I think that's what many people want to do with some of these types of events, the Negro
Right.
Leagues, this, the Glen Burke story. So anyway, I don't think you can perform at your peak ability when you have these sorts of outside things going on. So,
Yeah.
did, so
In
did,
Perry's case, if you're concerned that someone in the crowd's going to
yes,
assassinate you, how could you possibly play
exactly.
at peak ability?
Eh,
If your coach is not standing up for
oh
you in
boy,
that situation, how can
exactly.
you play at peak ability?
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it really it's something that is eye opening. And when they talk about privilege, and I don't want to get into this, too much, but I mean, as a white man, I do have mixed race, children who are Mexican Americans, but um, it is hard to understand those pressures as a white man. I can never be in Perry Wallace's shoes. I just it isn't there. I never had to deal with that. So I think if I've never dealt with that, I don't really have any say in what he may or may not have been going through, as far as that. He should have just shrugged it off. He should have just kept on going. No, you can't say that unless you're in there. You're in someone else's shoes. And I just, like I said, that's one takeaway in all of this. 30 some years of trying to find out all I could about Negro League baseball and that history. That's the one takeaway I've had, is most
Hmm.
people, they just try to put it numbers on a piece of paper, and it's just not that. There's more to it than that. But
Right. Or
anyway,
like you said there, that they try to dismiss the lived experience of
yeah.
these men.
Hmm.
Perry told me there were plenty of times where people would approach him maybe at class reunions, which he ended up going to. But oh, Perry, it wasn't as bad. That wasn't that bad. Trying to diminish
Hmm.
what he had actually been through. So I think you're absolutely right. It's not for us to say.
No, it's not. And anyway, I think I'm going to try to do all I can to raise awareness of that fact, and hope people go with it. Hope they understand it.
Hmm.
So this next book, to me, like I said, I mean, but when you get a review from Bob Woodward, I mean, man, that's something else, man.
Yeah.
when Bob Woodward likes your book, I mean, that's pretty impressive to me. And so this one here, like I said, having seen the Jesse Owens story and the movie, it it reminded me of that. But I had no idea that this was the first Olympics that the uh, U.S. fielded an Olympic basketball team. It was in
Right.
1936. Very, very cool.
Yeah. So I was out in Lawrence, Kansas, to speak about Strong Inside. And while I was there, I really wanted to see Allen Fieldhouse, where the Kansas Jayhawks play, and took a tour. And on that tour, they have James Naismith's original rules of basketball from the 1800s,
Hmm.
along with a picture of Naismith with the Japanese basketball player in the 1930s. And the person who was showing me around said, "Did you know the inventor of basketball, Naismith, was able to see his invention played at the Olympics?" And I consider myself a pretty big basketball fan, but I
Huh.
had no idea. And so I asked, "Well, which Olympics was that?" And when he said it was the 36 Olympics in Berlin, that's when I knew I had the topic for my next book. A chance to
Absolutely.
write about the invention of this, popular game, and in the context of Nazi Germany. And not just the Nazi Germany that a lot of us read about, which is, really the Holocaust or World War II. But I thought it was interesting. This is in the lead up to all of that, and
Hmm.
so what did Germany look like at that point? How did fascism take root there? And what were the similarities between what was happening there and what was happening in the United States at that time?
Hmm.
And so all of that made for what I felt was a really interesting topic to write about. I spent a lot of time reading about the invention of basketball, about Naismith himself. I went up to Springfield, Massachusetts, where he invented the game. I went to Almont, Ontario, where he had grown up, where you can see this big rock that was kind of the inspiration for basketball. He had played a similar game with friends that involved this rock when he was a kid. Um, I went out to McPherson, Kansas, where half of these Olympians came from. They worked for an oil refinery in this tiny town in the middle of Kansas. And the way they created the team that year in 36 is they played a tournament, and they said whichever two teams make it to the finals of this U.S. qualifying tournament, they would combine the rosters. They were
Hmm.
smaller rosters back then, of both teams to become the U.S. Olympic team. And so half of them uh, played for a company sponsored team in Kansas. The other half played for Universal Pictures in Hollywood.
Wow.
These guys all worked on movie sets in the movies of the 1930s, and they were the guys that were combined to head over to Germany to play in the very first Olympic basketball tournament. We won the gold medal that year, and pretty much have rarely stopped winning gold medals
Right.
since then. But it all goes back to the first Olympics in Berlin.
That is amazing. I had no idea. I mean, it's something about sports history. I mean, I love learning something new every single day. But when I saw that this was the first Olympics that basketball was in, it just blew me away because I had no idea. I guess some of these things you just assume.
Right.
Yeah, it's always been
And you,
around. It's always been an
yeah.
Olympic game.
And one thing you can notice from the cover there is they played outside.
Yeah, look at
They
that.
converted clay tennis courts to become the basketball courts, and it worked out okay in the first few rounds when the weather was good. But the gold medal game, which was the U.S. against Canada, was played in a driving rainstorm. Americans were hoping they would move the game inside, but they didn't. They said, "Well,
Wow.
we play soccer outside. You can play basketball outside." So the court became a big mud puddle. Players couldn't dribble the ball; just get stuck in the mud.
Oh
The
my
ball
goodness.
itself became incredibly waterlogged and heavy, and so the American players thought it was kind of a joke of a game. They won 19-8, which was a really low scoring game even for those days. But they had really hoped to show off their brand of basketball to the world. This was the first chance for a lot of countries really to see basketball played well. It wasn't a popular sport in Europe yet at that time. So the medalists were the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. Canada and Mexico haven't won a medal in basketball since then, but they didn't really get to show off the game because they felt it was just sort of a farce of a game in the mud.
Well, thank you, man. I mean, that was awesome. Just to know that they played this game outside. I mean, all this is it's just fascinating to me.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean that is just incredible. I mean, look at that. The net, it's shaped like a cone. What is that?
right.
That is just wild. I mean, that is the type of stories that I think people. just, I mean, they need to hear these stories, because the brand of basketball today, and I'm a Philadelphia sports guy. I grew up there.
Okay.
I watched a game yesterday. 76ers. I've been a fan of all the Philly sports my whole life. And
Yeah.
so to see them play, and then to try to equate that to 1936, playing outdoor in the rain, is just mind-boggling to me.
Yeah. Well, two things I'll say. One, Perry Wallace, the subject of my first book, was drafted by the 76ers when Dr. Jack Ramsey was their coach.
Interesting.
And Perry didn't make the team, but Dr. Jack really admired him. And so he set him up with a minor league team in Wilmington, Delaware, near Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
And the type of guy Perry was, while he was playing professional basketball, he was also coaching high school basketball and teaching math at a high school. It was Bartram High School. And there was one great player on the Bartram team, an eighth grader, and Perry thought this kid had a lot of talent. And his name was Joe Bryant. His nickname was Jelly Bean Bryant,
Yeah.
and his son would be Kobe Bryant. So Perry coached Kobe's dad in
How
high
about
school.
that?
Um, and then the other thing about this book, Games of Deception, there is a lot of basketball in it, but just like with my other books, there's a lot of social history also. And so, I deal with anti-Semitism in the U.S. and in Germany, racism in the U.S. and Germany, propaganda, on both sides of the Atlantic, coordination between Avery Brundage, who was the head of the American Olympic Committee, and actual Nazis, where he was asking the Nazis he said, send us some quote unquote positive coverage of your regime for the newspapers over here, because there was a concern he had that the U.S. would boycott those Olympics. And Brundage did not want the U.S. to boycott, so he's working with the Nazis to try to influence public opinion in the United States. All of that was pretty surprising, or less surprising the more you know about Brundage. But as I was doing the research, it was surprising to me how strong that coordination was. Even Fog Allen, the legendary coach at Kansas, who was the single person who was most responsible for basketball being included in the Olympics, he had been pushing for this for years, was working with Nazi officials to get them to include Olympics. And he received letters from Nazi sports ministers congratulating him that he had been successful and they were going to include Olympic basketball. So, it's some uncomfortable truths to discover and to read about in the book.
Absolutely right. And this, like you said, this was supposed to be 1936, the pinnacle of the master race, right? To show the superiority of the German athlete. Didn't work out so well in a number of sports for them, did it?
That's right. Especially Jesse Owens and other great track athletes, boxers. The U.S. though was dealing with its own racism at the time. Black players were not allowed to try out for the basketball team, so there were none on that team. There was one Jewish player, Sam Balter, and he was the only American Jew to win a gold medal at those Olympics. And he had a big decision to make prior to the Olympics whether he was even going to go. There were many people telling him not to go, just like there are a lot of black leaders telling Jesse Owens not to participate in those Olympics. They said racism anywhere is racism everywhere. Same with anti-Semitism. But in both cases, Owens and Sam Balter felt like the best thing they could do, knowing what they knew at the time, was to go to those Olympics and perform well. Both of them won gold medals, and that would be their way of disproving these notions of Aryan supremacy. And so you can debate whether their medals succeeded in changing anything, but those were the decisions that they made at the time.
Interesting. And all of these themes that we're talking about, the dealing with racism, anti-Semitism, and now we're into your latest book, this just came out recently, right?
It just came out March 2nd, just in time for baseball season.
Just came out a few months ago, but singled out the story of the first openly gay Major League Baseball player, Glen Burke. And, all of these books, like I said, the themes that my takeaways in reading about them is the dealing with adversity that all of these athletes had to do in all of the books. But then, the takeaway, I guess, would be none of these are acceptable. doesn't matter whether it's bigotry in any form of, whether it's racism, whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's anti-gay, you know, it's un-American. I mean,
Yes.
everybody should be judged on their abilities, how they do, how they don't do, and it just wasn't fair to any of these people. And these stories go back. They're just one of many that are weaved throughout our history. But everybody, to me, I would like to be judged on my own merits, not whether I'm discounted because I'm black or I'm Jewish or I'm gay or whatever the case may be. So we get to this book on Glen Burke. So tell us a little bit about why you picked this, and where it started.
Yeah. Well, for me, baseball's always been my favorite sport. I'm a big Milwaukee Brewers fan. I'm from Wisconsin originally. We've already talked about, I went to the Vandy college
Yep.
NCAA game today. So any excuse for me to be around baseball, I'll take it. But I was looking for another topic that involved sports and social justice. And I felt like the time was right for a book about the first openly gay Major League Baseball player.
Hmm.
And so I really enjoyed working on this. I talked
Uh,
to probably 30 or 40 people, major league, minor league teammates of Glenn's, friends and family members.
I'm going to put you back on here while we're talking.
Yeah,
All right.
did a lot of research about those teams that Glenn played on. But he had grown up in the Berkeley area, Bay Area. Was a phenomenal basketball player. In high school, his senior year, his team went undefeated and won the Northern California championship. He always considered himself a better basketball player than baseball player. He was phenomenal athlete. Everybody I talked to just raved about what a great athlete he was, which at one level, not surprising, a Major League Baseball player would be a great athlete. But when you think about the stereotypes that people had about gay men in the 1970s, especially the idea that the best athlete on the team was gay, was surprising to a lot of people. They
Hmm.
never would have imagined that that could be true.
Hmm.
As Glenn is working his way up through the minor leagues, there are at one hand, there's a major gay rights movement happening in the country in the early mid 70s. On the other hand, there's a very strong backlash to
Hmm.
it, a very strong conservative backlash to it. And so all of that is sort of swirling around as Glenn's trying to make it as a professional baseball player. The Advocate, the famous gay newspaper, wrote a letter to every major league team when Glenn was in the minor leagues asking to talk about the issue of gay players on their teams. And I have the response from the Minnesota Twins printed in my book where, they criticize the magazine for even asking that question, saying that it's basically, it would be an impossibility for there to be a gay player, and calling it a perversion, and calling baseball an area of total manhood, where there would not simply not be a gay person. And so that's the type of homophobia that Glenn was up against. When he made it to the major leagues with the Dodgers, the team discovered his sexuality and tried to bribe him to cover it up.
Hmm.
Offered him a $75,000 bonus for a nice honeymoon and asked him to get married, and he said to a woman. And when they said yes, he refused to go along with this plan. And he was quickly traded to the Oakland A's the next year. When Billy
Hmm.
Martin became the manager of the A's, he said he was not going to let a gay player like Glenn, quote unquote, contaminate his team. And he sent Glenn down to AAA. And Glenn knew he would never get a chance to be called up. And so here was a person who Dodger coach Junior Gilliam had said had the potential to be the next Willie Mays, who hit over 304 times in his minor league career, set stolen base records at two different levels of the minor leagues, who's run out of the game simply because of who he was.
So there you go. You just touched on that. I was going to say that he was a five-tool prospect. I mean, he could hit for power, hit for average. He had speed. He was a fantastic defensive player. He had the ability to become a star. And um, boy, oh boy, that is going to be the argument, right? Did he not become a star because of the pressures he was facing and what he was up against, or was he not good enough? I mean, you could
Right.
come down on either side of that. I mean, because everybody knows over the years the number of high baseball prospects that, for whatever reason, they just don't make it. So,
Right.
it's hard to say. But we do know in this case that he did have to face those pressures. He was traded for, and Bill North was a great ball player. In his day, I love Bill North, but Bill
Mhm.
North was already, about to be out of baseball, and they
Right.
traded away. How old was he at the time? 25, something like that.
Yeah, Glenn was 27.
Yeah, he
He
was
had
just
just
coming into his
started.
prime, right? I mean, he should have been anyway.
Yeah, he had just started game one of the World Series and two games in the NLCS. So he
Mm-hmm.
was a highly regarded player. You're absolutely right. There are a lot of people who will say, well, Glenn wasn't run out of the game. He played himself out of the game,
Yeah,
um, which I think is a bogus argument. I think that it's it's a fact that he was traded because of who he was. It's
yeah.
a fact that Billy Martin didn't want him on his team. So never really had a chance.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Not to mention, even when he was given opportunities to play, because of the sort of surrounding homophobia around him, if you're a ball player knowing that your manager and general manager don't want you around, that you can't be open even with your closest friends on the team, you're sort of living this double life, constantly looking over your shoulder, knowing that if you're discovered, you'll be run out of the game.
Mm-hmm.
How could you possibly be focused enough to succeed to the best of your abilities on the field?
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I would say about Glenn is, regardless of his statistics, he's a significant player in Major League Baseball history. And so I just wrote a column for the Los Angeles Times, making that point and sort of asking, why have the Dodgers not done more to recognize him? I'm not
Mm-hmm.
saying they have to retire his number or something, or you
Mm-hmm.
put him in the Hall of Fame, but at least talk about him. They've never mentioned on Twitter, other than the fact that he invented the high five, which is a pretty cool thing. But there's no articles about him on their website. They've had a very successful Pride Night, promotion for over a decade, but they haven't made Glenn sort of telling his story a part of that. And the Oakland A's finally did that this year. Glenn's other team renamed their Pride Night after Glenn
Mm-hmm.
and made contributions to the Glen Burke Wellness Clinic at the Oakland LGBTQ Center, which is a great start, But on the other hand, they really haven't told that full story about how Glenn was treated with the A's either,
Mm-hmm.
And I think in both cases, because we still don't have an active gay player come out in the major leagues ever, Glenn really officially came out after he was retired. And sports locker rooms in general are not considered the most sort of accepting places,
Mm-hmm.
very homophobic places. And so
Mm-hmm.
it'd be significant if these teams would, sort of acknowledge what has happened in the past and use that for good in the future, and
Mm-hmm.
say, hey, we messed up back then, but let's talk about why that happened, how we avoid it happening in the future, how we support gay players and fans today. If these two teams, the Dodgers and the A's, were willing to step up and do that, they would have in some ways the most credible voices, because they could acknowledge mistakes in the past and they could lead this conversation forward. And so I'm hoping that they'll do that. Is his experience I had with Vanderbilt, where, he had been treated poorly in the past, but they eventually came around and
Mm-hmm.
wanted to learn from that experience and share what they learned with other people. And yet you haven't seen that happen yet with the Dodgers and the A's.
Mm-hmm. Without even reading any of the comments, I guarantee you, I knew I told you this, um, but he only hit 235 and had a couple home runs. I mean, that's why they're not celebrating him. Ah, boy, that is not that's numbers. That's
Right.
statistics, and statistics are an important part of baseball and sports, no doubt. But they do not always tell the whole story. And in his case, like with the players in the Negro Leagues, the adversity that they're dealing with may have affected those statistics a little bit.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
opportunities that he got. I mean, that's a whole nother can of worms that we'll never know, unfortunately.
Absolutely. I think his statistics are beside the point when you're thinking about him as a significant figure in baseball. When you think about the extents this country has gone to punish or sort of prosecute gay men and women in this country, in Glenn's lifetime, uh, being gay was considered a mental illness. When he
Mm-hmm.
was young, you could be fired from your job easily. You couldn't get married. You're at a bar, the cops break in and start beating everybody up. But to think about that, that's the context that he was able to make it to the major leagues when there are so many things that can derail a professional athlete's career. It's remarkable that he was even able to make it to the majors, and so his statistics once he got there, I don't think really matter in terms of like why he should be someone that we know their story. That's all I'm asking is that as baseball fans, we should know this person's story. And in understanding his story and talking about all aspects of it is going to eventually create the type of environment where a gay player in the future might feel more comfortable coming out. And that's what we'd like to see. I think that would be so inspiring for young gay ball players out there, yet gay people in general, youngsters, to see this example that they've never been able to look at before. It would be incredibly powerful.
I agree. Uh, I wanted to ask you that. So uh, he does not officially say anything until after he's out of Major League Baseball. But obviously, everyone knew. How
Right.
early in his career did anybody know?
Going back to the minor leagues, when he was in Waterbury, Connecticut, one of his teammates, Marvin Webb, Glenn and Marvin had grown up in the Bay Area together. And Glenn refused or declined to live in a house with other players. He lived at the YMCA. And he said it was so he'd be close to the basketball courts, because he loved basketball. But really, it was so he could live his own life apart from the other players. And when they went to certain bars after the game, he was going to other bars. And he invited one of his boyfriends from California to come see him while he was in Connecticut, and he introduced him to Marvin. And so Marvin was the first teammate to kind of be in on this open secret, I guess you could call it. When he was with the Dodgers, guys like Davey Lopes and Dusty Baker, who I interviewed for the book, they were pretty sure they knew what was up with Glenn. They didn't really ask Glenn. Glenn didn't really tell them, but they knew, based on the way Glenn would excuse himself from social situations. They try to set him up with women. He'd make up an excuse like why he couldn't, or he'd leave after 2 minutes. The team would get back to the airport after a road trip, and all the players had their wives or girlfriends there to pick them up. Glenn would go to a completely other side of the airport to get picked up in his case, and yet you might expect that this locker room would have been a hostile place for Glenn. It actually wasn't. He was considered the most popular player on the team. And a large part that was set, the tone for that was set by Dusty Baker, who really liked Glenn. They both were from California. They both loved music. They both loved dancing and cool clothes and everything. So Dusty saw a lot of himself in Glenn, and also thought Glenn was just really funny. And sort of brought a levity to the clubhouse that they needed. A veteran team with high expectations. Glenn took some of the pressure off, and Davey Lopes said the same thing. And so when Glenn was traded, there were articles in the paper the next day about players sitting at their lockers crying. Steve Garvey and Don Sutton crying when Glenn was traded. And it's really shocking to think that a rookie fourth outfielder would have his teammates crying, that he was leaving. And that really shows what a charismatic or a strong personality, well-liked person Glenn was. And yet management said that it was unacceptable for him to be on their team because he was gay.
Interesting. And I suspect they probably knew exactly why he was traded too.
Yeah, they confronted the general manager afterwards, Al Campanis, and he wouldn't fess up to it. But Baker and Lopes knew. Dusty Baker went to the team trainer to see if he would admit why it happened. And the trainer did. He said, well, it's because he's gay. And Dusty said, they knew. And the trainer said, everybody knows.
And that's the other side of that. The other part two to that argument. First the stats argument. Well, he only hit this, he only did that. But then the other one is, well, why are we celebrating because he was gay, right? I'm sure people are saying, are we celebrating the first straight baseball player? No, that's not the point. The point is he should not have had to deal with that, and he did. And that's the reason why we're talking about it.
Absolutely. I've seen a lot of those comments on Twitter today.
I'm sure.
People just not getting it, and they also haven't read the article either, because a lot of the article is sharing this experience that I had at Vanderbilt, again, where people didn't want to tell the story initially, and the power that I saw when they started telling it. But back to your original point, so many people saying, well, yeah, right, we don't celebrate the first straight player. Why are we celebrating this person just because he's gay? Who cares that he was gay? Well, people cared enough to run him out of baseball because he
That's right.
was, and so that's the
That's
reason
right.
why you tell his story.
That's right. That's right. So the other endeavor that you're also involved with is the Undefeated with ESPN, and I wanted to throw that up because I'm sure there's a lot of people that do not even know what this is all about. If maybe you could take a minute, a couple minutes to tell us a little bit about that project.
Yeah. So Undefeated is a part of ESPN. You can go to theundefeated.com.
Mm-hmm.
It really looks at race, sports, and culture is sort of their focus, and race, especially or specifically African American stories. And so I feel really fortunate to have a chance to contribute to this site. I had a chance to meet Kevin Merida, who recently became the editor of the LA Times, but he launched the Undefeated, and he lives in DC, and so he knew Perry Wallace, and that was my introduction to him, was through my book about Perry Wallace. But it's a great place to go to read articles, especially in this last year since George Floyd, or going back to
Mm-hmm.
Colin Kaepernick, looking at athletes, black athletes, and issues that involve them primarily from the perspective of black writers, or certainly from the perspective of those black athletes themselves. And so I've had a chance to write for this website about Glen Burke, about Perry Wallace, about a man named Frank Dowsing, who was the first black football player at Mississippi State and was also gay. I wrote an article about C.M. Newton, who was a
Mm-hmm.
white basketball coach at Alabama and Vanderbilt, and the athletic director at Kentucky, and recently passed away. He was born in the 1930s in Florida, and I wrote about how a lynching that took place in Fort Lauderdale when he was 5 years old sort of affected his view on race for the rest of his life. And he desegregated the basketball program at Transylvania and at Alabama. He was the person that invited Perry Wallace back to be honored for the first time at Vanderbilt. He hired Tubby Smith as the first black coach at Kentucky. So I really enjoyed that. And then I went down to Ocoee, Florida, to write an article about what is considered the bloodiest day, election day in American history, about a lynching and the burning down of an entire black part of town in 1920, when black veterans from World War I just attempted to vote. You talked about how un-American some of this discrimination and racism,
Mm-hmm.
homophobia is. And on the one hand, I 100% agree with you. On the other hand, unfortunately, it is a part of America that we've always seen, this hostility towards people who are different, and towards African Americans in particular. And here you saw
Mm-hmm.
it directed even at veterans who had fought for this country in World War I. So I would highly recommend this site. Please check it out. It's got a lot
Absolutely.
of, it's sports, but it's also, movies and music and politics. And I think that people, white people especially, will see a different point of view than they usually see,
Mm-hmm.
and it'll be really enlightening.
I believe I agree. I was perusing it after I talked to you the other day, and again, this is another thing that I did not even know existed. And it was, I mean, every time I was on it for like probably an hour and a half, just clicking through article after article. They were all great. And,
Yeah.
and like you mentioned about the voting incident, I mean, we just had the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa race,
Yes, exactly.
and I guarantee you that most people had no idea that that even happened, and it's an unfortunate episode in our nation's history. And we cannot just paint over some of these things. You have to um, recognize them, deal with them, and hope that they never happen again.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think there's a direct line from events like Tulsa or Ocoee that I wrote about,
Mm-hmm.
and the racism we still see today, and especially
Yep.
as it relates to voting. The voter suppression we see today might
Yep.
not be burning down an entire town, but preventing people from voting in modern ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
The same thing. And what you also see happening around the country right now is an effort to prevent people from learning about this. In so many state legislatures and school districts, laws that are passing preventing controversial topics from
Mm-hmm.
being discussed, preventing racism from being discussed, which is a totally fascist type of thing to do.
Right.
And it's all tied together with these with the voter suppression efforts,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to avoid an election. It's a scary time. I've got kids that are 10 and 8, and I'm concerned about the country they're going to grow up in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, take some solace that, or it's sort of a stark reminder to me that a lot of people have been dealing with these issues for hundreds of years. And
Mm-hmm.
I think we have a false sense sometimes that things are progressing, right? That things will always be getting a little bit better. But it's a reminder that you always have to keep, unfortunately, you always have to keep fighting.
You do. You absolutely do. It's interesting what you just said though about education system. And down here in Texas, my kids have gone through. My oldest son, my oldest son's in the Navy now. My middle son is going off to Rice next year.
Mhm.
But uh, I just it used to just drive me nuts as they were coming through grade school and middle school and heading into freshman year of high school. They spent all these years talking about, memorizing a letter to Sam Houston and states' rights and everything, and it was like so upside down from what I learned growing up
Yeah.
as a kid. There was no mention at all to many of the things that I thought they should have been learning about, and
Right.
we talked about it all the time, and my wife and I, her being a teacher, but when they went to school, it was not what was being taught, and that's unfortunate, I think. But
Absolutely. And that's going to have an effect for decades when these are the kids that
yeah,
are making decisions and they have
I.
not learned these important aspects of American history. So,
Mhm.
my books are considered books for young adults. I hope that adults will read them also. And I write them in a way that adults won't feel like they're stepping down to read them. But a big part of my job before COVID, it was going to schools, going to high schools and middle schools and telling these stories, trying to get kids interested in reading, first of all,
That's where, yeah.
and I think sports is an interesting way to do that. A lot of
Hmm.
kids, it's accessible to them, but to tell these stories about social justice and hopefully make some impact in these young minds so that they'll grow up different and try to overcome some of these injustices that we've seen for so long.
That's right. So you touched on it a little bit, but what are you working on now?
Yeah,
What's your
my
next
next
project?
book it'll be called Inaugural Ballers. And it's the story of the first women's Olympic basketball team, U.S. Olympic basketball team, played at the 1976 Olympics in
I
Montreal.
never even that never even would have crossed my mind that would be 1976 would be the first for women's basketball. Boy, oh boy.
Yeah,
Okay.
40 years after the
Ah,
men,
amazing, right?
right. And there were women playing from the beginning. So, I mean, it was a
Right.
long time coming. But this book is timed to come out in 2022, which is the 50th anniversary of Title IX. And, uh, the book is told in the context of Title IX and the women's rights movement of the 70s. You mentioned you're a Philly guy, and there's a Philadelphia connection in the book. The best women's basketball team in the country in the early 70s was at Immaculata College
Oh yeah.
uh, in Philly, and Kathy Rush, the coach in Immaculata, was the U.S. Olympic. She wasn't the Olympic coach, but she was the U.S. national coach the year prior to the Olympics at the Pan Am Games and the World Championships. And so I'm actually writing a chapter right now
Cool.
about those Immaculata teams and Kathy Rush.
Cool. 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 Uh, and when is that going to be coming out? Next
It'll
year?
come out in the fall of 2022.
Okay.
And
Awesome.
hardcore sports fans, there were three players on that team that are names that women's basketball fans will recognize. One was Pat Head before she was Pat Summit,
Oh.
was a player on that team, and then the other two that went on to stardom were Ann
Wow.
Myers and Nancy Lieberman.
Wow, no kidding. Those are like three. They're like Mount Rushmore of
Yeah, right.
women's basketball, right? I
And they
mean,
weren't even
holy
the best
moly!
three players on the team, but they're the best known players on the team.
Awesome, awesome, good stuff, man. Uh, Anything else you want to add? This was great. I really I enjoyed this. This was really a lot of fun. Like I said, I love to get context behind these, why these were written, how you get into it. This was a lot. This was a lot of fun. Anything else you want to add before we wrap it up?
No, I mean, I just appreciate you doing this. First of all, what you're doing, I think it's really important, and I love the connection you have with the Negro Leagues and the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. I love visiting there when I'm in Kansas City. Um,
Yeah.
and I appreciate a chance to talk about my books. There are fewer and fewer venues to do that as newspapers decline and really don't have book review sections anymore. So
Right?
a chance to talk about it is not taken for granted. And it's been a lot of fun speaking with you. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. This was great. It was kind of last minute. I have I try to do this Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and then Wednesday. Okay, let me ask you this before we go. Are you familiar with the initiative, the campaign to um, name the Major League Baseball MVP award for Josh Gibson?
Yes, I mean a little. I that's the
Okay.
extent that I've heard of it.
So
Yes.
Wednesday nights I have on the several whoever signs up, because there's I think over 70 or 80 artists from all over the world, 5, 6, 7 countries that are part of this, and there's a little competition going on. That there's a bunch of celebrity judges and panelists that are going to come up with the winner of this. But every Wednesday I have a few of them on to tell their story and how they got into what they're doing, and what's been a lot of fun with that is when I talk to them, many of them, this is their first exposure to even knowing what the Negro Leagues were, or
Oh wow.
finding out more about it. Maybe they had a high level, but not really, as deep of an understanding of it. So if you get time, check that out, and if
Mhm.
let people know what's going on there as well. Because how that all came about was Kennesaw Mountain Landis was the commissioner of baseball, was on the award
Mhm.
prior, and last summer they took his name off. And so this summer
Right.
they're going to name someone else in his place. And so three of them that were picked were Josh Gibson, Branch Rickey, and Frank Robinson, and all three are worthy candidates. If that's whoever gets picked is great, but I am partial to the Negro Leagues. I think that Josh Gibson, it's not about the man, it's about the entire 3,400 plus players that did not get the opportunity to play.
Right.
And it's like what you said this earlier. This is not about saying that Glen Burke was a Hall of Fame player. This is not about saying that these guys were all superstars. They were not given a fair shake, and that's really what it's all about. So that's what putting Josh Gibson's name on there would represent. So,
Mhm.
so that I have those guys on Wednesday nights, and then Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday I try to do a guest. So, I really appreciate you doing this, because I just asked you this the other day. I had someone who he's a college professor as well, Richard Purser, who had something come up and he had to push to next Saturday. So
Okay.
this was great that you were able to come on here and do this. But uh, I think your books are fantastic. I recommend them to people. Get out there and read them. I would not think that they were young readers, although I think that that's the target audience that really needs to learn this the most.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So
Well, thank you. I appreciate the kind words, and again, a fan of what you're doing. So keep it up.
thank you, sir. I appreciate you. Have a good night.
All right. Thanks. You too.
All
Take
right.
care.
Bye bye.
Bye.